Good morning, everyone. I'm so happy you've all joined. This is going to be an amazing event, and I'm super excited to be hosting it. We have a great panel lined up for you today. We are focusing on the pain points that businesses have with respect to the voluntary carbon frameworks for reporting and offsetting. We have 3 distinct panel members that will be bringing their unique perspective, and they will be here to answer the questions that concern you the most. We have David Humphreys, Managing Director from Green Circle Solutions, Stephen Burt, Director from NQA, Richard Clark, Managing Director from Highland Carbon, and I'm your host, Mickey Senek, Executive Director from Global Connect Finance. I just want to start off this session, and during the whole panel, I want it to be very interactive, so we will be fielding questions throughout the discussion. So we definitely want to hear from you, and so to get your fingers a little warmed up, I just want to know from what city are you dialing in from today? If you can post in the comment section, that'd be great. London, Braintree. Okay, cool. Anybody from Scotland maybe today? From some far field that I don't know. Oh, nice. Buntingford. Okay. Manchester. Excellent. Welcome, Benjamin. Near Dundee. Great. Ooh, Musselburgh. There you go. There's one I don't know. Welcome, Nick. Oh, okay. Great. Okay. Another question I was curious to know from you guys is, what are you hoping to learn from today's webinar? What brought you here? I'd be curious to know if anyone can let us know what they're hoping to get out of this today. Is it more the regulation side, carbon credit offsetting? ESG. All right, ESG for sure. Anybody greenwashing maybe? A bit of everything. All right, Ian. Brings me to another question. Regards to your company or who you work for, or whatever, when you're trying to achieve net zero goals, what's the biggest problem you face right now? Something you wish you could probably maybe get more help with? I'd be curious to know as well what you guys are facing that's a big problem for you when you're achieving your net zero goals. Okay. How to reduce risks? Yeah. Time and money. Good one. Benjamin wants more about carbon credits. Got it. Okay. All right, good. Interesting. Keep them going. But I think what we'll do is probably move on. What I'd like to do is probably just give each of the panel members a quick chance to introduce themselves. So maybe I'll just start and then we can go David, Stephen, and finish with Richard. So again, my name is Mickey Senek. I'm Executive Director of Global Connect Finance. And basically, I helped all types of businesses raise money, either an equity investment, perhaps via family offices or private equity, basically for large-scale projects like energy, infrastructure, real estate, and also for venture capital money for startups who are looking for maybe pre-seed, seed, Series A funding rounds. And I also find alternative lending facilities for companies looking to borrow money where traditional high street banks have failed to provide funding. David?
Morning, everybody. My background originally is mainstream construction. I'm a civil engineer by origination. I love building stuff. I've done 20 25 years then in the sort of live events and exhibitions industry, still building and constructing projects. Always been passionate about sustainability, always very conscious of what that industry has, got some challenges in terms of sustainability, single use, etc. And I got myself qualified during the pandemic with IEMA, the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment, decided I could do something with it, so set up Green Circle Solutions coming out of the pandemic. So as Green Circle Solutions, we're offering sustainability consultancy too. It doesn't have to be the events industry, but we've got a sort of particular niche in that industry, looking to calculate carbon footprints and support people with carbon reduction strategies. We developed a suite of carbon calculation tools as well to try and simplify that process. And more recently, we've always been open to the opportunity of carbon offsetting, but more recently been aligning with Richard. So I'm intrigued to share some of the challenges that some of my businesses that we work with have around the offsetting piece, but also share some of the insights that sort of go with that. So yeah, nice to meet you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Stephen Burt. I'm the Carbon and Sustainability Services Director with NQA. So NQA are a certification body providing certification globally to various companies against various ISO international standards. But the part of the business which I'm involved with is as a verification body. So we are an independent, third-party, impartial UCAS accredited verification body. UCAS is the UK's national accreditation body, so the kind of highest standard of verification that you can achieve. And NQA provide carbon verification services against the international standards, the ISO standards for carbon quantification, carbon reporting, as well as carbon neutrality. So my role is to manage and oversee that work. I'm also a lead verifier myself for the various international standards against which we offer the services. And I've been involved for many years. 25 years or so ago, I would have graduated with a master's degree in environmental management and technology. It's great to see things have changed so much since then. 25 years ago, I would have been banging my head against a brick wall trying to get something like this organized. These days, it's obviously much higher up on the agenda for all businesses. I started off in consultancy and industry in various energy, carbon, sustainability roles. And for the last 15 years or so, I've been with NQA. I'm also a chartered environmentalist with IEMA. And I'm currently in the middle of my PhD looking at kind of data-driven approaches to net zero. And I also sit on a couple of committees representing the UK's input to the development of the international ISO standards for greenhouse gas management and for wider environmental management. So nice to meet you.
Very good. I'm Richard Clark. I'm the founder and managing director of Highland Carbon. I set up the company in 2017. My background is I'm a zoologist, so I have a master's degree in zoology. I've worked in international conservation and in UK conservation. I'm also an environmentalist. So throughout my whole career, I've worked in arenas like clean water, recycling, energy conservation, as well as land preservation and wildlife biodiversity protection. When I set up the company, I set it up as an ethical business from the beginning and to supply authentic projects with genuine credentials. I had some concerns about the carbon market at the time. And within the UK carbon market in particular, I didn't feel like it was really fulfilling its whole potential for biodiversity impacts, landscape conservation, and so on. So we offer projects which protect and preserve rare and endangered species, benefit landscapes, bring water quality impacts, flood mitigation benefits. There's often well-being, socioeconomic impacts, educational outcomes, and so on. So it's really a wide-ranging offer in terms of co-benefits, but with a depth and breadth in terms of landscape conservation and biodiversity. Latterly, we've begun offering units from international projects, And that's enabled us to offer sort of a menu of options for our customers and various frameworks which they can report on, and various sustainability development goal outputs as well. So we supply a menu of UK projects which we source ourselves and develop ourselves, and international projects which we curate using the same sort of rigor that we use with our ethical framework here in the UK.
Great, great. I saw that video. I'd like to maybe run that through again, and maybe you can walk us through some of the pictures there. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So really, we started off in the Scottish Highlands, hence our name, and we spread out across all of Scotland since our founding, and now we're in Northern England. But we consistently work in wild, remote locations where there's the greatest potential to benefit rare and endangered species. So these are just some of the species that benefit from our projects, which range from the very top of Sutherland, the very top of Scotland, across to the Isle of Harris, all the way down the west coast and all the way through the interior and into the Scottish borders. In England, we have projects in Lancashire and Northumberland and Yorkshire, and we plan to continue to expand where we offer our projects, but we're always going to have the same culture of achieving meaningful landscape and conservation impacts. Some of these projects are that are on the screen now. They include a wide diversity of trees planted, so it's the right tree in the right place. There can be between 12 and 20 species if you include shrubs and trees, so they are diverse projects.
Yeah, beautiful landscape too, no? Makes you just want to go up there.
I'm spoiled. I spend a lot of time in dramatic, wild locations, and I pinch myself every day when I do.
Yeah, I'm jealous when you tell me you're going on another trip.
Yeah.
Okay, let's dive into the first question. David, I'm going to address you first. I would like to address how important is it for a company to reduce their carbon footprint before they purchase offsetting credits? What motivates companies to do so?
I mean, it's a great question to start with. I mean, I think it's very important. I think everybody, and probably anyone that's touched on the subject, understands the need to reduce your footprint. Before that, step number one is to actually create your carbon footprint in the first place. You can't reduce, you can't assess, you can't do anything unless you've got a decent sort of corporate carbon footprint analysis. And that's what we do with businesses. And going in, we've always dived in and created very detailed reports from as early as possible. So really diving into the scope 3 parts. We've always avoided spend-based emissions factors, those kind of level of sort of high level stuff. So we've really gone into detail very quickly, but it always amazes me. You need to be doing it 2, 3, 5, 10 times, but certainly 3 or 4 times iterations of a carbon report before you can really understand where the main drivers of impact are. There's always a few low-hanging fruit. So actually working with businesses, having gone sort of as many as 3 or 4 or 5 iterations now of carbon calculations, people are starting to realize how difficult it is to actually make meaningful reductions. Once you've perhaps switched over to renewable energy, your scope 3 emissions are the real challenging ones to make reductions. But we've always, understanding how difficult it is to make reductions, we've always been open to the idea of offsetting. And I'm interested to learn as much as anybody else listening to the webinar today about this. So we've always been open to the idea of offsetting, aware of the sort of some of the cynicism and challenges that go around with that. But as we're finding, you need to make efforts to reduce, but it may take a few years to really actually be able to demonstrate meaningful, long-lasting 15, 25, 35% reductions. So I'm not shy about holding back. And so long as a business has got a grown-up strategy, and that'll take 2 or 3 years of working with them, but a grown-up strategy as to how they're going to tackle reductions, we've always been open to introducing offsetting. But again, interested to hear what the other guys have to say about appropriate projects. So very important to reduce. I'm sure we'll talk about the Oxford principles and the priority to start reductions before you really look at offsetting. But we're open to talk about offsetting with businesses sort of from the outset.
Yeah, and you mentioned low-hanging fruit. What would be some examples of like quick wins where companies can reduce their footprint immediately?
So starting from a baseline, it amazes me how little idea some businesses have about where, not just where their carbon emissions are coming from, but where their cost drivers are coming from. So, people will often not even have looked at their energy contracts for quite some time. Obviously, that's been brought to a head in the last sort of few years with the energy crisis. One of the obvious and easy ones is to tackle the energy contracts and switch over to renewable contracts if at all possible. Better still, of course, is to consider investments into solar. Get some solar on the roof. That's not always possible if you're renting and got use conversations with the landlord. That's always a good one. Depending on the business, introducing electric vehicles into the fleet. We work a lot with businesses that have got small fleets of vans, for example, that are moving goods around. Again, depends on the distance. There's challenges around that, but switching to HVO is a good one. So ways and means that you can make sort of chip away at the footprint. Could be 2%, could be 5%, but a few of those low-hanging fruit can start to make a nice, attractive, meaningful chunk that you can look to achieve over the first few years of doing this process. But as I stress to people, none of it happens overnight, and you do need to be in, understand it's a medium and long term system that we're process that we're involved with.
Yeah, great. Thank you, David. Stephen, the regulatory environment, it's obviously a big burden for a lot of companies. Could you run us through what the changes are in the voluntary carbon frameworks for reporting and offsetting?
Yes, so the recent developments around the voluntary market for carbon neutrality standards has been the development of the international standard, the ISO standard. It's called ISO 14068. It's difficult not to get into acronyms and numbers in my game. That's what it's all about. But ISO 14068 was published just towards the end of 2023. Because it's an international standard, it's for carbon neutrality. It's as robust and as credible a mechanism that's available to businesses to demonstrate that they're achieving carbon neutrality in the very best and very highest quality way, particularly because of the emphasis that it has on top quality carbon credits and top quality carbon crediting programs, such as the ones that Highland Carbon are involved in as well. It depends on a good solid carbon quantification process as the basis for it, which I guess Green Circle Solutions are involved in providing that service as well. But we NQA, we very much provide the independent, impartial third-party verification services at the end of the process. Interestingly, in all the clients that we've worked with, we've never started a verification with the same number as we've ended up the verification with. It always moves and always changes during the verification process itself. But they're all based on another standard, ISO 14064, which provides the detail, the requirements for how to go about quantifying the carbon itself. The new carbon neutrality international standard has replaced an older one from 2014, which was called PAS 2060. And as a result, it's strengthened very much so the criteria for the carbon offsets themselves. It's really raised the bar very high, and that's a response to kind of some of the cynicism around the marketplace, which David had mentioned previously there as well. There's also a requirement. The ISO 14068 standard is actually called transition to net zero. It's intended to use carbon offsetting, carbon crediting as a pathway on the overall route towards the business achieving net zero itself. So it's science-based targets that are used. You need carbon neutrality management plans. But interestingly, just to kind of reflect what David mentioned, it's based on a hierarchy. And the hierarchy is, obviously first to quantify your carbon, then you must reduce your carbon emissions first before you can ever make any claim around conformance to the ISO standard for carbon neutrality. And then, interestingly, you have to reduce the remove the carbon. So there's a requirement in there to remove carbon, which gets us into carbon removal credits, and only then are you able to offset the residual emissions themselves. So there's a much stronger hierarchy in the new ISO carbon neutrality standard compared to the previous British standard one. So it gives that real credibility about any claims that are going to be made as well. It covers additional things like, it gives us definitions of what the residual emissions are and how they can be tackled. It also gives us great links just to reflect what Richard was talking about earlier on, the need to consider other sustainable development goals, United Nations Sustainable Development Goals with the carbon crediting programs. So Richard gave a great example of biodiversity benefits and well-being benefits and other social benefits in the areas where the projects take place. So it's about wider things than just the carbon itself. It's the wider sustainable development goals. There's lots of other caveats in there. If you purchase carbon credits, you need to continually monitor them as a business to make sure that there's no reversals which take place, and there's public reporting requirements as well. So it is, the ISO standards, as you would expect, they're stringent in their requirements. They aim for the highest quality demonstration of carbon neutrality that it's possible to do so. They're globally recognized. And there's a degree of public reporting required in them as well. So it's all about transparency. It's all about credibility. And I'm very pleased that the new international standard for carbon neutrality is so much stronger than the old one, and it's aligned itself with the ultimate goal of net zero as well. So yeah, it's an excellent standard, I think.
Yeah, it's very complex. It's good to have someone like you who can help businesses, manage the complexities of it. It's incredible. Just to remind everybody, definitely post any questions you have, and we're happy to jump on that. I know Colin in particular is interested in how protecting the brand. So Richard, in terms of reputational risks, what do we need to do to avoid the offsetting and greenwashing claims that some companies have been impacted by?
Yes, I think the first one is really allied to what Stephen and David have been saying in terms of having a genuine plan to get to whether it's scope 1, scope 2, or scope 3 carbon neutrality. Incidentally, net zero means you cover all 3 of those, and there's probably not enough time to drill into those, but we can touch on them in a moment. So it's a reduction and then bringing in the carbon. From the carbon side, which is my side, I'll speak about some of the risks. One of the biggest risks is untraceable units. So I'm contacted probably every 2 weeks from someone with a random project somewhere in the Southern Hemisphere typically, and contacting me directly, asking me to buy units off them which are not traceable, which are not on a commodity exchange. Just to be clear, all of the transactions that we do are traceable at Highland Carbon. They're all off commodity exchanges, including the UK ones, which we highlighted earlier, and the international ones. So that's the most important one, is actually knowing where your money's going and that it can be traced to the project, and that the project has been verified by a third party, which is recognized. So that leads me into the third parties sort of frameworks that are out there that are accepted and recognized in reporting. In the international market, the most common one that we are supplying is the United Nations Clean Development Mechanism. It's the UN's own framework. So all of the others, in effect, answer to the UN, but this is their own. So it's very useful in that respect. We also sell projects in the gold standard and verified carbon standard. In the UK, our projects are all verified within either the Woodland Carbon Code or the Peatland Code, which are the 2 codes which are officially accounting towards the UK's commitment to the Paris Agreement. So they are official. That's the important point. There's a few other things which are more sort of tangential to this, and it's to do with kind of cultural issues, I would say. One of them is around, in the UK, there can be an issue of people being cleared off the land. At least there's a risk of it. Some of the newer projects that are developing essentially take over an estate, exploit the renewable energy, set up holiday lettings and various other things. That can be okay, but provided they're not forcing farmers and others off the land in order to do those things, reputable suppliers will be keeping those people on the land. What we don't want is Highland clearances Mark II, and there is a risk because there's a lot of value in some of these projects. So that's one of the cultural things. In the international arena, companies will have, especially the larger companies, will have very robust policies around things like anti-slavery, money laundering, fraud, and so on. And there can be risks in the international market of falling afoul of corporate policies. If I were to give you an example, it could be a country where the West would consider the wages to be within slave labor sort of levels, or where people are held in detention, as in China. That can fall afoul of some corporate policies. Some of the general considerations around things like one of the things I call the auditor broker trap, which is where one goes with an auditor who is also the supplier of the carbon, and they only supply from their own portfolio. All of us here in this panel are independent, so we can work with whoever we want, and that means any company who works with us has the freedom. There are others who will set up a contract to say they'll audit and manage the reduction, but then the company is required to buy off them without knowing what the margin is on that sale. So for us, as an ethical business, we are transparent about our margins and our wholesale prices and so on. So there will be no gouging that happens when working with us. So we typically sell, it can be half or even a third of the price of some of the others who work in that way. One of the other things to consider is what I would call sequestration versus avoidance. This is something that Stephen touched on. For certain reporting standards, you need a sequestration. Sequestration is drawing greenhouse gas out of the atmosphere and locking it up. So, for example, forests draw CO2 out of the atmosphere and they lock it up in their trunks and branches and roots. And avoidance is something like renewable energy, or in the UK, peatland projects classify as an avoidance. Both have merit and both are important, but it's just important to be aware of what you're reporting on and what the particular standard requires you to report on. I have customers who do come to me and say they only want a sequestration, and I have others who are open to everything. So it really depends on the culture of the company, but it's worth flagging up. The other thing I would say, and this is particular to the UK, is the difference between a low quality project and a high quality project. So when I started the company, what I noticed is a lot of the projects in the UK, I would describe them as tree farming rather than restoring wilderness. So tree farming, where maybe a few species of cheap trees are planted on typically arable farmland, and then sold on at a margin to the buyer. Incidentally, when I set up the company, some of the margins that the suppliers were making were 40% or 60% plus. Our margin is on our UK projects is typically it's between 7 and 12. It averages at 10, depending on scale. So we're selling quality projects with a low margin, and so that's important. What you don't want to do is to get gouged and be buying a project that has dubious credentials, because that's where the greenwashing claims can come in. They can come in either because the company isn't genuinely reducing, genuinely considering its footprint, or because the nature of the projects that they support are not really authentic, don't have meaningful impacts. I think some of this more will come out in conversation But those are the main points I was going to make.
Yeah. No, I when I first got involved, I was amazed at how wide the range was between different pricing, and just how you could get something very cheap and you just didn't really know where was the real value there. So yeah, it's quite interesting.
Yeah.
I agree. I'm going to open it up to the whole panel now. Some of these questions, just to get everybody to chime in from, again, your unique perspective. But let's run through some of the myths about carbon offsetting.
Yes. One of the myths is that it's expensive. So I think if one looks at the sort of services that David and Stephen's companies supply, they will be creating a pathway to savings in future. So there may be some capital outlay which is programmed in over time. So David mentioned electric charging points. There could be solar panels on the roof of a warehouse or whatever it is. Over the period, that results in savings. Energy is extremely expensive. And so one of the myths is the company will dig itself into a hole if it goes down this path. Actually, it can work out very well, especially in the medium and long term.
I think for me, one of the myths, and it's interesting to get your guys' feedback tying into the frameworks and the legalities around it as well, is that offsetting per se isn't necessarily making a claim of carbon neutrality. And offsetting, if it's done in the right scheme, I don't think there's any question an offsetting project is going to create a positive impact. It's going to be good. I think where a lot of the cynicism has arisen is this link with offsetting immediately to becoming or making claims of carbon neutrality. What I've been doing with businesses, understanding that it's going to take several years to really be able to demonstrate proper reductions, but not wanting to wait until you've reduced by 30% before you actually start offsetting, is to create a grown-up offsetting strategy aligned with their carbon tracking, but not necessarily make claims of carbon neutrality. So not be too hung up on literally offsetting or neutralizing the whole calculated carbon footprint. Is that fair to say, guys? Is that sort of avoiding some of the risks and the myths around it, so that we're not absolutely having to comply with ISO 14068 because we're not actually making a claim of carbon neutrality, but we are doing some offsetting in a positive way?
I'll chime in on that, and then I'll hand over to Stephen. But what I find is some companies are absolutely committed to achieving carbon neutrality in part of the business. So if I was to give you an example, we have a carbon neutral furniture supplier as a customer. The first carbon neutral Scotch company is one of our customers. It could be transport or delivery or something, as long as that fits with a particular framework that they're buying, shipping, for example. Or it could be that they're more concerned about nature and the narrative around nature and water quality and impact. So sometimes there's different drivers. But to your point about timings and claims, those who are buying projects in the UK, I describe them as being sort of like futures, because in effect, we planted forest where there wasn't one, and it takes a certain amount of time for the carbon to be sequestered and into the biomass. So they're committing to a time in future when they buy the UK project. So it could be, for example, one of our customers is committed to being net zero 2050. Well, a number of them are actually. Some of them are 2045. It varies. So they're actually buying units from us now, so they will land at the right time to make that claim. And then they can make the claim in the present while they're undertaking these reductions, or have already undertaken reductions. International units can supply claims for net zero sooner than that. So it's horses for courses, and we provide whatever the customer needs.
And I think to back up both of those points, the international standards, they require, there's a whole list of requirements around the carbon credits themselves, and also the carbon credit and programs. But a couple of key ones are that the projects themselves cannot be more than 5 years old at the time that the carbon neutrality claim is made. and the carbon credits have to be retired or removed from the public registry within 12 months. So it's all undertaken in a very timely manner within the constraints of ISO 14068. And one of the big changes with ISO 14068 compared to its predecessor is that reduction in carbon emissions is mandatory before the claim for carbon neutrality can be made. So when we hear, myths around, it's companies are able to carbon offset without actually reducing their overall carbon footprint, the international standards are geared up to make sure that the reductions take place first, and then removals are considered, which are in their, certainly technological engineered removals are in their infancy, but the reforestation, afforestation ones which Richards offers are commonplace. But that need to, if you wish to be verified against the international standards, that need to reduce before offsetting has been a vast improvement from my point of view in terms of tackling that myth that a company can just take their overall carbon footprint, offset the lot, and carry on business as usual. And that's no longer the case if you're adhering to the international standards. So, yeah, it's moved on leaps and bounds in recent years, I think.
If I may, Mickey, just on one other myth is that this marketplace that we are in, we're talking about the voluntary market now, is for high polluters to buy their way into polluting. And so just to explain, there's two markets. There's the mandatory market, which is for heavy industry. So you've got, for example, steel, glass production, I think concrete, and heavy manufacturing and transport. We aren't in that space. We are in, and by the way, oil is also in that. We're in a separate market, which is voluntary. So the companies that we work with, by definition, don't have to do this. They're doing it to be good corporate citizens, and they want to report on positive environmental impacts for nature and for water and for people and so on. So the myth that heavy polluting companies are using our arena to get away with it, if you like, is not accurate. I can't speak very much to the mandatory market, but they do have their own. They're required to report. B, they're required to reduce and offset anyway. So they're doing what's required. But so the idea that companies are getting away with it, I think it comes from maybe in the past companies would just buy an offset and not do any reduction, and that did happen at times, and that's a problem. And I think we would all acknowledge that has happened, and that's not what we are about. And it's really not. All of the companies who we work with, they sign up to an ethical framework, so none of our customers are doing that.
Yeah, and likewise, it's the voluntary marketplace which we operate in. The companies that we work with are very well intentioned, very well organized businesses aiming at carbon reductions, carbon crediting for the right reasons. That they are actively aiming to reduce their carbon footprints, and when it comes to their considerations around the carbon crediting programs that they use, they do have to and want to think about the wider environmental, social governance type sustainable development issues around the practices that they undertake when they procure carbon credits. So it is entirely voluntary. It is driven more and more by customer demand, though it's not regulation, but supply chain demands drive this harder and harder each year. There's expectations if you want to be involved in winning certain contracts, including with certain government agencies, that you're involved in quantifying your carbon, reducing your carbon, even procuring carbon credits. So it's becoming more business as usual for many companies because of supply chain pressures, but it is voluntary, and those companies that are involved are at the forefront, I think, of leading the drive towards net zero.
I could just expand on Stephen's point. It's very much contracts. So it could be somebody going for, I don't know, a rail or a freight or a shipping contract or whatever it is. It could be a major public sector contract, or with the NHS even. The private sector, scope 3 is what a given company reports in relation to its supply chain. So if you are selling into a bigger company, you are part of their scope 3, and they will want to know that you have the right credentials so that when you appear in their reports, everything's pucker. So it's becoming not just the norm, it's becoming essential. It's in the real economy. It's not an esoteric thing. It's absolutely essential for business.
Absolutely. I mean, one company's scope 3 emissions is another company's scope 1 and 2 emissions. Not completely, but largely. And that's where the supply chain pressure piece comes from. If you're sitting with as a business with very high scope 3 emissions, then a good way to tackle that is through your supply chain, and having your supply chain tackle their own scope 1 and 2 emissions. It goes a long way towards impacting the customer's scope 3 emissions. So yeah, that driver, because of supply chain pressures, as well as drivers around competitive advantage and risk reductions, is a key one that I see on a day-to-day basis.
Sorry, just to chip in on that, just to tie that together. Is it fair to say, notwithstanding following the ISOs and actually demonstrating reductions, if someone has offset their footprint, understanding that they are perhaps a bigger corporate's scope 3, further up the food chain, if that's been offset, therefore that part of the footprint for the larger corporate can actually, they don't have to consider that as part of their calculation anymore. Effectively, that has become zero.
So
footprint.
the ISO standards have strict controls around double counting and the avoidance of double counting, rather.
Yep.
So there's criteria laid out in them about how any one business can demonstrate and evidence that it would be double counting if they did include some or all of their supply chain's carbon emissions in their own carbon calculations. And a large part of our job when we do those verifications is to check that the evidence that they've provided, the justifications they've provided, and the information that they've provided to demonstrate that the double counting can take place. It's the checks that we make which permit them really to be able to do that. But it's laid out within the ISO standards what those checks are and what's required from the companies to evidence them.
Yeah, brilliant.
We have a question from George who wants to know who certifies the carbon neutrality claim under ISO 14068.
I do. So it's organizations. You'll probably find, George, that if you Google it, you'll find several organizations who can verify is the term we use rather than certify. There'll be various companies who will offer to verify a carbon neutrality claim under ISO 14068. The very best way, the most credible way to go about it is to use a UCAS accredited verification body. So I mentioned at the top of the webinar, UCAS is United Kingdom Accreditation Service. So they regulate, they govern everything that we at NQA and at some of our competitors, how we organize things and how we undertake our verifications. So in terms of achieving verification for carbon neutrality under the ISO standards, the best way is to find a verification body which is accredited by UCAS, such as NQA, who can provide that service for you. It's worth just making clear as well there, we're not consultants. We won't tell you how to do it. That's really where Green Circle Solutions, for example, come in. We verify the data that's been produced, and we verify the reporting that's undertaken, and we make sure that it's undertaken in conformance with the ISO standard, but also that the data is correct and there isn't any claims being made which can't be substantiated. So yeah, that's. I hope that answers your question, George.
Yeah, yeah, and keep them coming. So let's see. We've touched on sort of the expense of having to report, also all the complexities of reporting as well. We obviously know and we all agree that this is the right thing to do. But are there any competitive advantages from being carbon neutral?
Yes, I mean, I can speak to that. Just going back to the example of the furniture company. Imagine they're supplying the NHS or a local council or a national law firm or a bank or whatever it is. They will have a competitive advantage in selling into those markets because of the credentials. And you could use that sort of narrative for any of our customers, really, and how they gain advantage. It could be business to business or business to organization, as I mentioned, or it could be just business to consumer. But even in the business to consumer example, I mentioned Scotch, there's lots of them like this. They would then be in the report for the grocer, if you see what I mean, so that they're in the supply chain for the grocer or the retailer or whoever it is. So there's definite real competitive advantages. And if you've got two brands that are very similar and the pricing is similar or within range, this can be the one thing that flips it for that company.
I agree. The clients that we work with, as I mentioned previously, it is all voluntary, but the drivers behind it often are about gaining a competitive advantage. You know, those businesses just quite simply wouldn't procure our services unless they were going to gain a competitive advantage from doing so. You know, they're able to win business, they're able to demonstrate their credentials to their customers, they're able to respond very strongly in tender documentation that they receive, which more and more these days is asking companies what their scope 1, scope 2, often what their scope 3 emissions are and what they're doing about that, what their net zero targets are and how they're going to achieve the pathway to net zero. So yeah, it's all about, from our point of view anyway, and the experience that we see, it's often about competitive advantage as a driver for it. And the question of double counting that we mentioned earlier on as well, and Richard's point that, you know, all other things being equal, price, for example, and quality, for example, if a business is able to compete on those two things, but it's got the added competitive advantage of having quantified its carbon emissions and done something about them and offset them, and is able to credibly operate as carbon neutral, that's the extra mile that company can go in terms of responding to those tenders and winning business. So yeah, it's a commercial thing. It's a competitive advantage thing for many businesses.
I would say at the SME level that we're dealing with in most cases, that absolutely it's still in its infancy, but there's absolutely a commercial motivation as part of this. It's not just about wanting to do the right thing. And you can see there's a ripple effect happening as the bigger corporates gradually realize more and more that whatever services the SMEs deliver are part of their footprint. They're going to start asking, they're going to want to buy carbon neutral, verified carbon neutral products and services. So yeah, it's happening slowly, but it's absolutely going to multiply very quickly. I think we can see that at the level we work at.
Yeah, it speaks about the power of a consumer choice and the power of the consumer's purchasing vote at the end of the day, right? When you're comparing A to B, who you're gonna invest with or who you're gonna spend your money with. So that's great.
It's first, Mickey, just point out as well that, in order to be able to make a claim of carbon neutrality, you must, 2 steps back, have actually quantified your carbon, and put numbers to your scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 carbon emissions. And that in itself is a competitive advantage, even if you don't take it the step further towards carbon neutrality, which in my opinion would give an even greater competitive advantage. But the process all begins with the data, the carbon data, quantifying it, making sure it's correct. And that first step provides a a competitive advantage in itself, and that is the starting point for carbon neutrality. You can't go any further with carbon neutrality until you know what you need to deal with in terms of carbon emissions. So it's almost a double whammy in terms of competitive advantage by going down this route. It gives you the ability to respond to customer and stakeholder and end consumer queries and pressures in a couple of ways.
If I may, I'll just expand on that, because that's a very good point about stakeholders. In any company of any size, that they have considerations around employee retention and recruitment, and it can be extremely competitive. I mean, I give the example of, say, the finance or professional sectors. They're recruiting for the best and brightest people. So it can be really helpful in that arena for HR purposes. But also, expand that out a bit in terms of the larger companies which are publicly traded. You get into investor relations, ESG reporting around environmental social governance is one of the key drivers in annual reporting and investor relations. So it's essential for the bigger companies, but it brings benefits to companies of all sizes.
Yeah. Yeah. Stephen, you mentioned something earlier about changing attitudes, and it kind of made me want to address this to the panel. But based on your experience over the last 5 years or longer, when you first started in this, what is the biggest change between clients that you had at the beginning compared to now? Not only their attitudes, but their approach and sophistication towards carbon neutrality or whatever.
Mm-hmm. So, I've been involved in this business and sort of network and industry for a long time these days, and it was very much in the early days. Certainly, there was a small number of companies who would be interested, and it would be the businesses which were kind of forward thinking at the forefront of particularly around the environmental and the social side of things in those days. And then over the years, I've seen it develop where, perhaps 10 years ago, the companies, you would have the forward-thinking companies involved, but you would also be having an increasing number of companies who were only involved because their customers were telling them to do so, if they wanted to win contracts and retain contracts. And then it's moved on beyond that now, where we're seeing the kind of snowball effect of that, where more and more businesses are becoming involved as the snowball rolls down the hill and gets bigger. There's just so many companies wanting to be involved for the right reasons, as well as the commercial reasons that are associated with it as well. And we shouldn't forget, it's a changing legal landscape out there as well. If you read the UK government's net zero strategy, which they've renamed, but the moving of the thresholds around legislative compliance for carbon management is a feature of the landscape as the country tries to move towards 2050. So at one time, the only companies that I would encounter who, for regulatory reasons, had to think about carbon were the very large ones that Richard mentioned: the steel manufacturers, the cement plants, the power stations, the oil industry, and so on. And over the years, additional smaller pieces of legislation have come into force that have begun to impact upon the SME type market in terms of carbon quantification, small to medium-sized companies, and that trend is growing as well. So I've seen the regulatory landscape change. I've seen the voluntary landscape change, and the end result has been more and more companies are involved. But certainly in my experience, the companies that we work with are involved for all the right reasons. They want to do it, and it's an internal driver, stakeholders, as Richard mentioned, but also that competitive advantage piece and the risk reduction piece as well. The credibility, the risk of greenwashing claims, and these can all be avoided with a credible, robust verification and credible, robust carbon crediting programs.
If I chime in, I've seen a cultural change. So I attend a lot of sustainability events in London and elsewhere.
Yeah.
And gosh, going to those maybe 12 years ago, 15 years ago, it was very niche and you'd only have certain sectors there. Now it's absolutely mind-blowing how how broad it is, the breadth of the companies that are there, the sectors that are there, the topics that are being discussed. And it's at the senior level, for those companies, typically you've got the MDs and CEOs leading the conversation around it. So it's really, there's been a major cultural shift. And I understand, for the climate, all of us who are concerned about the climate, we want to see things moving faster and broader. But I have a lot more hope. I know it sounds strange to say because there's a lot of news in this arena which isn't very hopeful, but I have a hell of a lot more hope than I did, say, 15 years ago, just based on seeing, the emergence of hydrogen jet engines and renewable energy driven steel and so on, which are outside of our arena. But, even in those places, you're seeing change that's coming. So I think we'll get to a sustainable future. At least I hope so.
An interesting feature that I see is my daughter is coming out of university, and her classmates, they're looking for jobs, and their priority is to work with companies who can demonstrate, ESG credentials. They don't want to get into the kind of historical industries where pollution was associated with. They want to work in more forward-thinking organisations, and that's an interesting feature that people coming out of university, they're aiming to work with the type of organisations that are involved in all of this. So again, that gives them a competitive advantage, even in attracting talent as well. So, and that's part of the wider cultural change I think that Richard was referring to.
David, you must have some stories.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I can certainly echo. I mean, certainly, I've only been embedded in this world for the last few years, but even in that time, seeing that snowball effect, which does genuinely give us hope. Sometimes I do wake up and think, why are we bothering? But I was hosting some training sessions this week, and the level of engagement is already completely different, starkly different compared to a couple of years ago, where we were having to sort of justify why we were doing this. Whereas now people are actually, we're not just getting people that want to find out, we're actually getting people who are sustainability officers coming along. That post just didn't exist a few years ago. So there's huge momentum building, but like Richard said, it still really needs to gather pace. But there's enough there to have hope that it's going to move in the right direction. And I think it will accelerate quite quickly. And answering a couple of the questions that are arising. Voluntary offsetting, is it going to start to become mandatory? I don't know whether you guys have got any idea of time frameworks, but I think possibly legal pressures will start to come into place, the widening the net of mandatory corporate carbon reporting. But I think the corporate, the high up, the listed companies that are legally compelled to report at the moment, they're gradually realizing, or very quickly now starting to realize, the full impact of their scope 3, which is the rest of us, the SMEs in the supply chain, and they're wrapping us all into that for them to be able to comply. So I think it'll come from the commercial direction as well as the legal direction that will help that snowball to gather momentum.
Yeah, I think Stephen can speak to this better than I, but from my perspective, there's definitely been more of a requirement for reporting. And there's more legal requirements depending on what sector you're in and what you're doing. So, for example, if you are exporting into Europe, there's increasing requirements there. So I think it will deepen in the UK. It'll become a bigger thing over time. How quickly that happens, I'm not entirely certain, but the companies who start the journey will be far better positioned to be ready for anything that's coming.
Yeah. There's a great website that I like to look at. It's called netzerotracker.org, and it holds the top 2,000 publicly listed businesses in the world to account based on their net zero targets. And then it gives a kind of red, amber, green rating of how they're progressing towards those net zero targets. there's far more reds than there are anything else, and there's far more oranges than greens. You know, every business is committing to net zero targets, or many businesses are. And actually, later on this year at the UN Coalition of the Parliaments meeting, the 30th one in Brazil in November, ISO will launch a brand new standard which will be for net zero aligned organizations. And I think that will become a business as usual standard for any company, in the same way as, for example, ISO 9001 quality management standard. You just have to have it if you want to win contracts. So I think the new net zero standard, which will be called ISO 14060, launched in November 25 this year, will be over time it will become voluntary but mandatory, if you know what I mean, if you want to win contracts. And I think 14068 will be a part of that. It'll be part of the move. Carbon neutrality will be part of the interim measure on the path towards net zero that organizations need to achieve. And that particular website demonstrates quite effectively that the progress being made in the publicly listed companies, the big ones, it's not sufficient at the minute for net zero. So more is needed, and it's coming, I think.
Okay, let's get a little technical. Let's talk about how a company would actually apply or bank the pending units purchased. And I know Gordon is interested in knowing at what level of carbon trading makes it financially worthwhile. Richard, maybe you could start.
Oh gosh, that's an interesting one. I'm going to start it the other way around. So making it financially worthwhile, keep in mind that this is about narrative. So a company is achieving a narrative as well as the particular certification and hallmark. Companies with a relatively small footprint can actually achieve it very low cost with a very strong narrative and a very huge advantage. So that's one sort of end of it. So we have worked with a number of startups where it's essentially been an important part of their journey. For the larger companies, it's not necessarily an enormous cost relative to their overall business costs. So is there a threshold? I would say no, because we sell at all levels. You know, we can sell 10 tons or we can sell 500,000 tons, whatever the company requires, we will work with them. That separates us from some of the other brokers who will only trade at, say, 25,000 tons plus. So we do supply a lot of small businesses, and we're happy to do so. And going back to my point about startups, they will scale up anyway. So if they have the right culture at the beginning, they'll become useful customers to us and also have a significant impact. So the other question was about banking units. So the international units that we sell can be used immediately. So those count towards, net zero claims for that part of carbon neutral claim for that part of the business at that moment. The UK units, which we're selling through forestry projects, for example, they count towards future claims. As I mentioned earlier, companies might make a commitment to net zero 2050, and they can use some of those units towards 2050, and some of them might land later, depending on the date that the forest was planted, the growth rate of the trees, and so on. So that's where they're sort of like futures. The term in our sector is pending issuance units for forestry and peatland. But just think of them as futures. You can use them; they are real, but they land in future.
Okay.
I would, in response to the sort of financial threshold question, I'd reiterate what Richard just said. There isn't really a threshold, but a lot, even at the SME level that we work at, a lot of it is about creating a carbon budget from the outset. So if you've calculated a carbon footprint for a baseline year that might be 1 or 2 years ago, and you want to offset that, even £2,000 or £5,000 or whatever it is, not a huge amount, but if you haven't got that money, it's coming out of your profits. So as you start to get a better appreciation of your kind of scope and scale of your ongoing annual footprint, with or without reductions, but hopefully starting to demonstrate reductions, you can start to create a carbon offset budget. And again, part of it is the communication piece that Richard just touched on. Whether you do it overtly or discreetly, it actually tends to be a relatively small percentage of whatever it is you're selling, whether it's just pounds of revenue or 10 pence per widget that you're selling, and you either add that onto your invoice, either visually so that clients can see what you're doing, or probably do it discreetly and just start to build up the carbon budget, and then the pot of money exists at the end of the year, so the offset becomes an ongoing process that you're able to do, so you're not just absorbing it from profit. So I think it depends how you tackle it, but I think it's once you're 1 or 2 years into the iterative process, then I think it's relatively straightforward to account for it.
Yeah. Stephen, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, it's within the realms of the ISO world where I operate. There are decisions that have to be taken by the companies which wish to seek verification to the standards, and the decision might result in a tipping point where it becomes more sensible to procure technologies to reduce their carbon than it is to procure offsets to offset their carbon. However, because of the requirements of the ISO standards and the need for the reductions to be achieved before the offsetting, then it simplifies that decision for them. That they're aiming to reduce the use of offsets over time as they aim for their 2050 net or 2045 or 2040 net zero target. So they're investing in both reductions and offsets simultaneously. And they do have to balance that up on a year-on-year basis, but the reduction piece is mandatory. So we would see that, and then they'll offset the residual emissions that are left over after that stage.
If I could just chime in on something, it's I understand a lot of people who work in sustainability sometimes feel like they're in a bit of a silo. They might be the only person in the company or part of a small team who's focused in this arena. It's the importance of communication with people like us, and also with people in other businesses you might not think of talking to. So I'm aware of, for example, a Scotch company where the excess heat from that company is going into a greenhouse for another company that's nearby. So both companies are benefiting from that. It's being a utilized resource. I've also heard of, for example, companies where, particularly in the field of logistics, you may have big warehouses in the same industrial estate. There could be a connectivity charge of £50,000 to put in the grid connection, to put solar panels on the roof, and it's not worth it for any one company to do it, but there's 8 companies in the park. You talk to each other and get it done. I think this area of collaboration is going to be really important for those sorts of things. And with an open mind and a positive attitude, there's usually a way through it that's profitable and beneficial, and also helps with the whole ESG reporting side.
Yeah, great point. Collaboration is always going to help. I'm going to open it up to the Q&A to the group that's with us to see. I know we've covered a lot. I'm sure we haven't covered everything, and there's always a chance for somebody else who can ask a question. Every question is a good question, so don't be afraid. Please address it now if you've got a chance, because we'll probably be wrapping it up after this.
Well, while people are typing in questions for the moment, I just wanted to flag up, there was some media a couple of years ago about deforestation projects, and I think offsetting took a bit of a hit at the time. So just to speak to that was one framework by one, is a subcategory of one verifier. So it was Verra was the verifying agency, and the category was REDD+, which is reduction of environmental degradation and deforestation. The critique at the time was that deforestation didn't happen as quickly as predicted, so it was actually a good news story. But the algorithms weren't correct in terms of the predictions that were being made by the agency. So that's an example of some risk, and we moved away from that framework, selling from that framework. I understand they have recalibrated now, and they're doing a new approach. But at the time, that was used as sort of a battering ram against the whole sector. And I think that was unfortunate, because without this space, without all the investment that's going into nature and renewable energy, we'll never hit the Paris Agreement targets or any of the other climate conference targets that have happened. So I'd say don't let one story like that cause you to lose faith in the whole of what's happening.
Yeah, great point. Great point. Okay, I think we're going to wrap this up. I think we're going to post each and everybody's email on there, so that anybody who's watching can take down the email and then perhaps personally send a message with your questions there. So I'm not sure if that's going to come up or not, but we will definitely get that out to you and made that available to everybody so that you can reach out with any further questions you have. Okay. All right.
Thank you,
thanks
everybody.
everyone for coming. Panelists, thank you so much. It's been great. Excellent.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye.
guys.
Thank you. All the best.
See you later. Bye.
Bye-bye.